Yes, and the reason we call it the capital of suspensions is, of course, because Sacramento is the state capital, but it is also home to four of the top 20 suspension districts in the state of California. And in many ways, it mirrors what we see in DC. Washington, DC, you have, the political power that runs our nation, surrounded by some of the worst schools in the country. And in many ways, Sacramento is the DC of the West.
Wow. So why do you think that it's important to bring light to this issue?
It's important to bring light to this issue for a number of reasons. I mean, it affects students' learning, growth, and development in school if they're constantly being suspended or expelled. It directly relates to individuals' later reliance in their life upon social services, so there's definite economic impacts. I think there's also even greater impacts when we consider the direct linkage that research has shown between suspensions and the school-to-prison pipeline. And in fact, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, really there are two pillars to the pipeline. The first is exclusionary discipline, suspensions and expulsions. And the second is overplacement in special education. And you put those two things together, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to prioritize this report and prioritize this conversation.
And so I couldn't help but notice that the report focuses a lot on Black males specifically. So why the focus there?
Well, the focus on Black males is really a function of the data. So we've done a number of reports like this over the years. And invariably, we have found two patterns that when we're talking about the highest suspension rates across the state of California and in Sacramento, invariably, it's our Black male students. And then interestingly, in our other research, we have found, particularly in collaboration with our colleagues in Sacramento, that the highest expulsion rates are for Native American males. And that's why you see so much movement around BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and those movements in education, really trying to highlight these issues because of that interlinkage between exclusionary discipline in these two communities.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not really sure, but did you and some of the other researchers look at why, Black students and Native students are suspended and expelled at such higher rates?
Well, in this particular study, we did not, but in many of our prior studies, we have. And invariably, it comes down to differences in racial background. And unfortunately, what we find is that Black students overall, and particularly Black boys, Black students overall, are treated very differently than all other students. And this behavior begins in the earliest levels of education, where they are suspected of wrongdoing because simply being Black. They're therefore more closely watched by educators for wrongdoing. They're labeled as being bad, aggressive, physical, defiant. And then as a result, we see that they are singled out for punishment. And when they are given disciplinary action, we oftentimes find that it is more prolonged and more intense than it is for other students. So we see all these patterns, particularly when we've done hundreds collected data from hundreds, I should say, of parents of Black children. And invariably, these are the same stories that we hear over and over and over again. So we know from that data, but also from extensive research done by a number of other scholars, that this is really a function of bias and mistreatment that is endemic to our country. We have in the midst of two pandemics, as many people have said, really the pandemic of COVID-19, which has had adverse impact on minoritized communities through loss of employment, infections, and death. But we're also in the midst of a anti-Black pandemic, and which has lasted, of course, for hundreds of years. And of course, for something to be a pandemic, it has to be global, right? It can't be something that's localized or regional. And unfortunately, anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon that has a unique strain here in the United States. And we've seen that with the murder of George Floyd, Marbury, Breonna Taylor, and many others. And there is a direct linkage between what we see in the issues in policing and the issues that we see in schooling. In policing, we know that Black people are hyper-criminalized, and undervalued in terms of their lives. Black lives are criminalized and undervalued. But we also know that in education, those same patterns take place where Black students, their participation, their involvement, their engagement is undervalued and they are over-criminalized. And we see this play out again in these two big patterns that lead to the school to prison pipeline: significant over-representation in placement in special education and significant subjection to suspensions and other forms of exclusionary discipline. But I think what the report really finds that's the most concerning is that when people think about suspension, right, they think of quote unquote, in their minds, bad kids in like high school and middle school. And first of all, I push back anytime on the notion that there is kids who are bad, right? We have people who have opportunities to learn, to grow, and to develop. And while we certainly see that the highest suspension rates are definitely in middle school, we found in this report 25% for Black males, and 16% for Black females, which is incredibly high. But what we look at is we look at the disparity. What is the comparison between this group and the statewide average? And the greatest disparity in suspensions is not in high school, it's not in middle school, it's not in latter elementary, it's in early childhood education, where in this district, they are 10.4 times more likely to be suspended than their peers when we're talking about our Black male students. That is egregious. Essentially, what the district has done is taken Black kids from potty training to punishment, and we think that has to be addressed.
Potty train to punishment. Wow. And if we could kind of linger on that just a little bit more, I noticed that in fact number 3, the report talked about how the disparity widens for students who have disabilities, students who are unhoused, students who may be from a lower financial status. Can you talk about that a little bit as well? Because it seems like, these kids are up against a lot and then they come to school and then, like you said, they're being punished.
Yeah, I mean, we break up by these subgroups because it's important for people to understand that these patterns look different across communities within the Black community, right? And we have found a much higher suspension rate for students with disabilities, which is incredibly concerning. But I think the one the rate that really stood out for me was what we found around foster youth. And being a former foster child, growing up in a foster home, when I see these data, it really, I think it saddens me, it enrages me in some ways, but we're talking about being 38%, right, in terms of a total suspension. Now, let's put that in context. The suspension rate for Black male foster youth in the district is 38%. The statewide suspension rate that we would expect to be the barometer for all comparisons is 3.5%. 3.5%. So we're talking about rates that are so much greater than the state average that at some point, it really should be a clearing call for any group that's engaged in this work. I would say this, I would go one step further than something that we said in the report. I would say that there needs to be citywide and statewide legislation that says that we will not be suspending our foster kids, right? And if we are going to be doing so, right, that there needs to be the social worker who's involved so that it is a reparative and restorative thing and not something that is simply a disciplinary action. But across the data, we remain concerned about what we're seeing. Overall, across the board, we found that our Black male students are 5 times more likely to be suspended than the state average. When I think about this is more reflective of what we would expect to see from the South in the 60s and 70s, not from supposed to be one of America's most progressive cities. And I just saw the report that came out that mentioned that Sacramento, congratulations, is the #1 hottest housing market based upon realtor.com. But think about it, when people go to buy a house, what are the first 2 things they look at? They look at price and they look at schools in the local community. So the city will never be in a position to be able to benefit from that designation because we have schools are failing our children. And any parent that would see this data, I would assume would say, I don't want my child to be in that school. I don't want them to be affected by this. And that's why in the report, what we did is we went a step further. We went and named some of the most egregious schools that are doing these suspensions, with one school having a suspension rate up to 45%. That means that nearly half of their Black children are being suspended in a given year. At some point, there has to be some real action on the ground to address this.
And for these schools, and please, feel free to name them. Is there something, I guess, like linking the worst off schools when it comes to its number of suspensions of Black students?
So generally what we find in our work is that schools in more rural areas tend to have higher suspension rates. We oftentimes find differences based upon demographics and school locations. Mm-hmm. But the truth is there's no real strong factors you can ever truly point to other than the educators who are there and their preparation to engage people who look like them. The truth is, if you think about people who go into teaching, so this is not teacher bashing, right? This is about just calling out for what it is, right? A lot of people who go into education aren't reflective of the communities that they go and teach in. Most teachers who teach Black children are white. That's just a statement of a fact. There's a national statement. And so you have individuals who oftentimes have never been in those communities, who aren't prepared to go in those communities because many colleges and universities don't do as good of a job as they should in preparing to go and teach. And one of my colleagues, Chance Lewis, he said that, you can't train someone to go and teach in a space that you've never been. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it deals with preparation, but it also deals with holding people accountable. Oftentimes we find that it's not every single teacher at a school who's doing this. It's a group of teachers who repeatedly suspend students over and over and over again. And the schools struggle to hold them accountable, either because they don't want to, because they're fearful of how there might be retribution from their collective bargaining agreements. Whatever it might be, it creates a significant problem. And one of the things that we saw in the last report that we did, because this is a follow-up report to the first report that we did, right? In the last report, we saw that Elk Grove was number, I believe, 3 or 4 on this. And this year, and up to number 1. We still focused on Sac City because we needed to do a further deep dive into understanding what's taking place there. But what I worry about is that these challenges are now metastasizing throughout the city. And that's why you're seeing that the top 4, that Sacramento is home to 4 of the top 20 suspension districts in the state of California.
And I want to go back to another point that you touched on, because I saw it in the recommendations, but, how can restorative justice be used to turn these numbers around?
Well, restorative justice can easily be used to turn it around. I do personally believe in restorative practices where we are viewing discipline as a process to better educate and enlighten. We see that colleges and universities use discipline as a process to educate and enlighten. I don't know why we don't see this same thing when we're talking about kids in kindergarten, where it seems to be even more appropriate. But the challenge is with restorative practices is that many schools don't implement them in the right way. And for you to engage a true restorative practice, there has to be something to restore. And that's why I have to go back to the data that we found in early childhood education. How can you restore something where it began off on the wrong foot? In K through 3, in our last report, we found that the Black males in the district were 9.9 times more likely to be suspended in that age range. And in this report, it's went up, not down. As Betty Williams from the NAACP said, Sacramento has doubled down despite being informed about these very issues. But as you mentioned, it would be important to identify and talk about what are some of these schools. So I want to reset this by saying, again, the statewide average for what we would expect a suspension to be, an unduplicated suspension, is 3.5%. But here's some suspension rates that stand out to me. And these are, I'll first go just the top 3 for Black male students. Cesar Chavez Intermediate has a 45.8% suspension rate. Again, statewide average is only 3.5%. Rosa Parks has a 38% suspension rate. Oak Park Prep, 38% suspension rate. Kit Carson, 37%. Elder Creek, 37%. Wilsey Wood, 37%. You go to Black female students, and the rates, we always know that rates for female students are oftentimes lower than that of male students. Some of it deals with perceptions of teachers and how they engage boys differently than girls in terms of discipline. But we see incredibly high rates in comparison to what we would expect. John Sloat for Black girls, a 26.8% suspension rate. Wilsey Wood, again, 26%. Hiram Johnson, 26%. So one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of schools on the list that are both suspending high rates for Black males and for Black females. But oftentimes one of the things that people will say is, well, okay, this is clear. We need to move our kids to private schools. We need to go to charter schools, right? Traditional, out of a traditional public school and go to a charter school. But when we start looking at disparities in those schools, we find the same patterns. And oftentimes what we also find is that even if the school shows that they have a lower suspension rate, it's not a function of actual suspension, right? It's a function of strategies and practices that proactively push out and bar people from coming in. So they just have a different way of doing the same game.
Mm-hmm. So what do you recommend? I mean, how can Sac City and schools in Sacramento, schools who appear on this top 20 list, how can they decrease their rates of suspensions for Black students?
Well, first of all, there's a lot that they can do. And we have seen districts, Los Angeles being one, that went from having exorbitantly high suspension rates to very low suspension. So this has been done, right? Mere mortals have accomplished this task before. But here's some things that I think that need to happen that we as co-authors of this report think need to take place. First, there needs to be either a district-wide or city-wide task force on exclusionary discipline. We need to identify these schools that have these egregiously high rates, which we've already done, and there needs to be direct follow-up with those schools. There needs to be better training and development with those schools. Separate from that, across the entire district, we need intensive ongoing professional learning for all educators. Topics that people view as lightning rods, but they really need to be taking place. Implicit bias, microaggressions, culturally mediated behaviors, teaching practices for children from diverse backgrounds. We also, I believe, again, there should be a wholesale rejection of suspending foster youth. I think that is just absolutely egregious that students who are in the most need of support and love and care are those who are being targeted for exclusion and segregation from their classrooms. The third thing, or the next thing rather, that I would say is that we need to provide better avenues to students so they can report educators who are unduly targeting them. And I'm not just talking about students in high school and middle school, I'm talking about even at the highest levels. I've done work with children in kindergarten where we said, who are the teachers who are nice to you? Who are the teachers who treat you well? Who are the teachers who are mean to you, who yell at you? And a young kid, even in kindergarten, can tell you who treats them well. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that some people are going to hear this and they're going to say, well, these recommendations, this costs money, right? And then I'm going to say a quote from a colleague, Dr. Sammy Scales. It shouldn't cost us money to treat people decently. And that's what we're talking about. And while we've talked about advice for the schools and the districts, I think it's also important to provide advice for the parents of Black children, right? And to be a parent of a Black child, right, you can be of all different backgrounds. Again, I'm adopted. I have a parent who's parents who aren't, right? But you can have, there's a need for there to be better information on what to do. So the first thing I would say is never, and this is a quote from Dr. Andre Brandt, a colleague of mine here at San Diego State, never leave your child in an unhealthy environment, even for the sake of a quote unquote school, right? A lot of parents say, well, it took me so much to get them into the school, or this is a school that's closest to my house. I understand that, But what you don't want to do is to leave your child in a situation where there's going to be damage, because that damage will be manifold over time. The second is, I would tell parents, never assume that your child deserves the suspension, especially in early childhood education. You have a kindergartner, first grade, second grade, third grader who's being suspended. You need to ask why. You need to see what that evidence really is. Don't assume that the school has good intentions. There are certainly educators who have good intentions, but you should never assume that those good intentions are in place when it comes to your child. The second thing, or third thing that I would say is, never allow a teacher or principal to refer to a child as a problem child, as a bad child, as a troublemaker, as being aggressive, as physical, defiant, all the different labels that are attached to us as Black people, and then follow us throughout our educational trajectory. You know, one of the reasons that I got into doing this work, because of my own experience. I grew up in a community where there wasn't a lot of Black people. In fact, it was me and my brother were the only ones in the school that we went to. And when I was in 5th grade, I was suspended 42 times by the same teacher, repeatedly, over and over again, 42 times, right? And it went unreported, my guess. I bet you the state of California never knew that took place. So that's one of the reasons I tell parents, don't always assume those good intentions. There can be educators who have good intentions, but never make the assumption when it comes to your child.
That's some good advice. I think those are all of my questions. I'm sure there's tons more we could talk about on this topic. But I want to give you the opportunity to talk about or bring attention to anything that maybe I didn't ask that you think is important to bring up in this study.
Yeah, I would just like to make one final connection here that I think is absolutely critical. We see the challenges in terms of how Black people are treated in policing. It's important for us to recognize that the same behavior and mistreatment occurs in schooling. So it's important for us to link Black lives and Black minds. Black lives and Black minds are intertwined. If someone does not value the life, then they certainly will not value the mind.